I didn't scream. I didn't throw my napkin on the table and storm out. I just sat there, holding my fork, staring at the candle in the middle of the restaurant table, while my mother-in-law's words settled over me like ash after a fire. Honestly, sweetheart, we only kept you around because Daniel needed someone stable. Now that he's back on his feet, we think it's time you understood your place in this family. Which is to say, there isn't one anymore. My father-in-law nodded slowly, like she'd just read aloud a grocery list. I set my fork down, very carefully, very quietly, and I smiled. Because 3 weeks earlier, I had already met with a lawyer. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I'm a registered nurse, which means I've spent the better part of a decade watching people say terrible things to each other in moments of crisis and telling myself that words, by themselves, cannot break bones. I believed that for a long time. Then I married into the Hargrove family, and I started to wonder. I met Daniel at 24 at a hospital fundraiser where I was volunteering, and he was the kind of handsome that makes you forget you were supposed to be pouring drinks for other people. He was funny. Warm. He laughed with his whole chest. His mother, Margaret, was there that night too, and she hugged me within 20 minutes of meeting me, both hands on my shoulders, looking at me like I was exactly what she'd been hoping for. "You're a nurse," she said. "Daniel needs someone grounded, someone responsible." I thought it was a compliment. We got married 2 years later. Small ceremony, backyard of Daniel's parents' house in Maplewood. Margaret insisted on hosting. She said it was her gift to us. She planned the flowers, the menu, the seating chart. I let her because I had no family of my own to speak of. My mother passed when I was 19. My father had been out of the picture long before that. And I was so hungry for the feeling of being folded into something that belonged to someone. That was my first mistake, confusing being used for being loved. The early years were good, or at least I told myself they were. Daniel worked in finance. He had a streak of anxiety that would flare up badly every 8 or 9 months, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, would spiral for weeks at a time. I was the one who drove him to appointments, who sat outside the therapist's office reading old magazines, who called his office and made excuses when he couldn't get out of bed. I didn't mind. That's what you do for someone you love. Margaret called me every Sunday. At first, I thought it was because she liked me. Over time, I realized the calls always circled back to Daniel. How was he sleeping? Had he had any bad weeks lately? Was he taking his medication? I was essentially her reporting system, her early warning network. I answered every question honestly, because I thought we were on the same team. We were not on the same team. About 3 years into the marriage, Daniel's father, Richard, had a health scare. Nothing life-threatening, but it shook them both. Margaret started coming over more. She had a key. Daniel had given it to her before we got married, and I'd never thought to ask for it back. She would let herself in on Tuesday afternoons while I was at work, and Daniel was in his home office. She'd stock the fridge, do a load of laundry, leave a casserole on the counter. Daniel thought it was sweet. I thought it was something I couldn't quite name yet. The thing about being slowly pushed out of your own life is that it doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in 100 small ones. It happens when your mother-in-law starts answering questions at dinner that were directed at you. It happens when she books the family vacation and doesn't think to ask about your work schedule. It happens when her name starts appearing on the joint account statements. "Not taking money. Just checking," Daniel said. "Just in case." And you realize that the word "just" is doing a tremendous amount of work in that sentence. I brought it up once. Carefully. Over dinner, when Daniel and I were alone. He looked at me like I'd said something in a foreign language. "She's trying to help, Claire. She's always been this way. You knew that when you married me." I had not known that when I married him, but I nodded, and I let it go, because I was tired, and because his next anxiety spiral was already building at the edges and I didn't want to be the one who lit the match. 4 years in, Daniel got a promotion. A significant one. He was steadier than he'd ever been. Good medication, good therapist, real progress. I was genuinely proud of him. I told him so constantly. What I didn't say out loud was that I had spent 4 years being the scaffolding that held the building upright, and now that the building was standing on its own, no one seemed to remember the scaffolding had ever been there. Margaret started making comments, small ones, at first. "Daniel's really come into his own, hasn't he?" said while looking at him, not me. "He just needed the right environment to thrive," said while gesturing at her own kitchen, where we were having Sunday dinner. "I always knew once he was truly supported, he'd be unstoppable," said to her friend Barbara, loudly enough that I was obviously meant to hear, but vaguely enough that I couldn't object to any specific word. I started keeping notes, not because I knew what I was going to do with them, just because something in me understood that I needed a record, a nurse's instinct maybe. Document everything. You never know when it becomes important. The notes became a folder on my laptop. The folder became organized by date. By November of that year, there were 41 entries. Then came the dinner. It was my birthday. 31st. Margaret suggested a restaurant, a nice one, the kind with cloth napkins and a wine list, and said she wanted to celebrate me. Her word, celebrate. I should have caught the irony in the way Richard didn't quite meet my eyes when she said it. But I was wearing a new dress and I wanted to believe her. We were on the main course when she set down her wine glass with a small, deliberate click. "Claire," she said, "there's something Richard and I have been meaning to address." The temperature of the table changed. Daniel was very still beside me. Not surprised still. Prepared still. That was the second I understood he had known this was coming. "We think," Margaret continued, folding her hands on the tablecloth like she was chairing a board meeting, "that this marriage may have run its course. Daniel has worked incredibly hard to build the life he has now. And we feel it's important that going forward, his support system, his real support system, is properly positioned to help him continue that growth." Richard cleared his throat. "What Margaret is saying is that we've consulted a family attorney. We believe a separation would be in Daniel's best interest." I looked at Daniel. He looked at his plate. "And," Margaret added, almost gently, almost kindly, "we want you to know we're grateful for the role you played. You were exactly what Daniel needed at the time. But honestly, sweetheart, we only kept you around because Daniel needed someone stable. Now that he's back on his feet, we think it's time you understood your place in this family, which is to say, there isn't one anymore." There it was. 4 years. 4 years of Sunday phone calls and casseroles and swallowed objections and 41 documented entries, and a marriage that I had tended like a garden, and I had been, this whole time, a temporary measure. A tool selected for a specific job and now being returned to the shelf. I looked at Margaret, then at Richard, then at my husband, who was still studying the pattern on his dinner plate, like it contained the answers to questions he didn't want to hear. And I smiled, because 3 weeks earlier, I had already met with a lawyer. Here's what they didn't know. 6 months before that dinner, I had gone in for a routine check at the hospital where I work. A colleague of mine, a doctor I'd known for years, noticed I looked tired in the way that isn't fixed by sleep, and she asked me, quietly, over coffee in the break room, whether everything was okay at home. I told her the truth, the whole thing, the key, the account access, the comments, the way Daniel went quiet when I raised concerns, the way I had started feeling, in my own house, like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome without realizing it. She listened. Then she said, "Claire, what you're describing has a name, and you should talk to someone who handles it professionally." She gave me the name of a family law attorney. I made an appointment for the following Tuesday. His name was Robert Callahan, and in our first meeting he asked me 3 questions, listened to my answers, and then said, "Tell me you've been keeping records." I told him about the folder. He smiled for the first time. Over the next 6 weeks, we built a case, not for anything dramatic. I wasn't delusional about what I had or didn't have. But what I did have was documentation of financial access that hadn't been disclosed to me, a pattern of interference that crossed specific legal lines given our marital assets, and something else. Something Margaret didn't know I had. A recording. 2 months before the birthday dinner, Margaret had come by the house on a Tuesday afternoon. I had taken a rare weekday off, a shift swap, and I was upstairs when I heard the front door open. I came to the top of the stairs. She didn't hear me. She was on the phone in the kitchen, and she was talking to someone, I assumed Richard, about the timeline. About waiting until Daniel's bonus cleared. About making sure the asset review was finished before they had the conversation with Claire. I stood at the top of the stairs with my hand on the railing, and I listened to every word. Then I went back to my room, and I sent a text to Robert Callahan that said, "I have something you need to hear." So when Margaret set down her wine glass at that birthday dinner, with those folded hands and that boardroom voice, I was not ambushed. I was not devastated. I was a woman who had spent 6 weeks preparing a response to a speech she already knew was coming. I let her finish. I let Richard finish. I let the silence sit for exactly 5 seconds, long enough that they both thought I was absorbing a blow. Then I reached into my bag and placed a document on the table. "I've retained legal counsel," I said. "This is a formal notification of contested asset claims related to undisclosed marital financial access. Robert Callahan's contact information is on the second page." Margaret blinked. "There's also," I said, "a separate matter I've asked him to address, regarding a recorded conversation from October 14th, in our kitchen, while you believed the house was empty." The color left her face in a slow, even way, the way water drains from a bathtub. Richard put down his fork. Daniel finally looked up from his plate. I had prepared for this moment in the car on the way over, running through what I would say, how I would say it, whether I would feel anything in particular when it arrived. I had expected anger, maybe, or grief. The way you grieve a version of a life you thought you were living. What I actually felt, sitting there in that restaurant with the cloth napkin in my lap and the candle between us, was very calm. The specific calm of a person who has already done the hardest part and is now simply delivering the news. "I want to be clear," I said. "I'm not here to make a scene. I'm not here to fight. I've already talked to the bank. I've already talked to a counselor about Daniel's medical history as it pertains to financial decision-making, and I've already signed a lease on an apartment." I paused. "What I am here for is to finish my birthday dinner, because the salmon looks wonderful and I haven't eaten since this morning." I picked up my fork. Margaret opened her mouth. I looked at her very directly and said, "I'd think carefully before the next sentence." She closed her mouth. We sat in silence for about 45 seconds, which is a long time at a restaurant table. Then Richard said, quietly, that he needed some air, and he and Margaret excused themselves. Daniel sat across from me, not speaking, for a long moment. Finally he said, "I didn't know about the recording thing." "I know," I said. "I believe you." "Claire, Daniel." I set down my fork again. "I spent 4 years loving you as carefully as I knew how. I don't regret that. You're a good person who was raised by people who made every decision for you, including this one. But I'm not able to keep being the thing that holds your life together while your family decides whether or not I'm worth keeping." I looked at him, really looked at him, the way I had on that first night at the fundraiser. "That's not a marriage, that's an arrangement, and I deserve better than an arrangement." He didn't argue. To his credit, he didn't argue. The divorce process was not simple. It was not quick. Contested asset claims rarely are. But Robert Callahan was very good at his job, and the recording was, as he put it, clarifying in ways that made certain conversations between the opposing attorneys significantly shorter. Margaret called me twice, once to ask if we could talk, once to tell me I was making a mistake. I let both calls go to voicemail and saved the recordings in the same folder as everything else. Old habit. The apartment I'd signed a lease on was small, the second floor of a house in a neighborhood near the hospital, with a window over the kitchen sink that looked out onto a maple tree. My first night there, I unpacked 3 boxes and then sat on the floor with a cup of tea and listened to the specific silence of a space that was entirely my own. I thought about the fundraiser, the backyard wedding, the Sunday phone calls, the casseroles, the 41 entries in the folder. The moment I stood at the top of the stairs and heard a woman calmly organizing the removal of my own life. And then I thought about the look on her face when I placed that document on the table. The color leaving. The silence. The complete, total miscalculation of who she thought she was dealing with. I finished my tea. I made a second cup. I thought I should call my friend from the hospital, the one who gave me the attorney's name, the one who asked if I was okay over coffee in the break room on an ordinary Wednesday, when I had told myself I was fine. I called her. She picked up on the second ring. "How did it go?" she asked. "I had the salmon," I said. She laughed for a long time. I laughed too, sitting on the floor of my apartment with the maple tree outside the window and the empty boxes stacked against the wall, laughing until something that had been wound very tight inside my chest finally, slowly, let go. There's a thing they teach you in nursing school about patient care. You cannot pour from an empty cup. You have to fill your own cup first, or eventually you have no capacity left to give anyone anything. They say it as career advice, a reminder not to burn out. It took me 4 years and a birthday dinner to understand they were also saying something else. They were saying, know what you're worth. Not what someone else has decided you're worth. Not what's convenient for the people who rely on you. What you are actually, genuinely, in your bones worth. I know now. I knew it the moment I set down that fork the first time. The moment I chose not to cry, not to storm out, not to give Margaret the performance she had scripted for me. The moment I understood that being prepared is not the same as being cold, and being calm is not the same as being beaten. Some people walk into a room and expect to find a victim. Sometimes they find someone who already met with a lawyer. My cup, these days, is full. I make sure of it.